Whenever we develop a new normative case study, we make a point of organizing a few preliminary case discussions to see how different groups respond to the case. One thing we've learned from this process, we call it field testing, is that even small details can shape how groups engage with one another and with the facts of the case. Ultimately, field testing has taught us that micro-level details play a huge role in how people approach cases, and that we won't know that we've written a strong, useful case until we see how groups react to it.
However, we have developed some rules of thumb over time that help guide us in making micro-level case decisions. Ellis and I are going to share these rules of thumb, and we'll also hear from other case authors about their experiences applying these rules to their cases.
One key rule of thumb is that groups regularly accord less weight to the interests of stakeholders who receive only passing mention. Rocky Choices, as you know, centers around how elementary school teacher Mrs. Brown should balance the needs of all of the students in her classroom, including Kate, who struggles with emotional regulation and who often commands significant amounts of the teacher's time. In an early draft of that case, Mrs. Brown and Kate were the only characters explicitly named in the narrative. While we mentioned the needs of other students, these students didn't show up in the case itself.
When we were field testing early versions of the case, we found that discussion participants were consistently failing to accord much weight to the needs of these other unnamed students, and they would solve the case by having Mrs. Brown pay even more attention to Kate. To try to fix that and encourage readers to think more seriously about the needs of all students, we ultimately created two new characters to represent two additional students in the class, Philip and Frank. In our subsequent testing, we found that the revised case led groups to see the ethical dilemma of balancing the diverse needs of all students much more clearly, leading to richer discussions. While this change didn't fundamentally alter the central ethical dilemma of Rocky Choices, it made an enormous difference in how effective that case was as a tool for supporting deep ethical reflection.
So now when we're writing our cases, we think carefully about which stakeholders in the case need to be fleshed out into multi-dimensional characters to give their concerns and interests greater weight. Our other case authors have found this rule of thumb useful as well. Let's hear from Daniela Forster, who revised her case, A Fair Go, after participants in the field test were uniformly sympathetic to one group of stakeholders over all others.
My case, A Fair Go, written with Sam Douglas and Scott Immig, focuses on a public school principal who's rethinking the school's Anzac Day traditions to find ways to provide safe welcome for newly arrived, traumatised refugee background students, whilst maintaining support for struggling Australian-born students from the school's high poverty area. When the case was field tested, no international participants really appreciated the significance of the Anzac tradition in Australian culture. And they solved the case by centering the refugee students during the Anzac Day commemoration. They didn't pick up on the difficulties that the community is facing, with one reader wondering whether that would have complicated their view of the case. One stakeholder representing the needs of struggling Australian-born students, Robbie Jones, wasn't mentioned during the discussion at all. To address this problem, I created a stronger backstory for Robbie. I fleshed out his social, emotional, and family context a few different ways, indicating defiance with authority through his interaction with the principal, and dialogue demonstrating his father's instability. I gave insight to the kinds of war games Robbie liked to play with his school friends, and offered more clarity around his teacher's concerns about his friendship behaviour and the impact of his father's wartime experience. I also added a clearer description of the traditional Christian prayers recited in the Anzac service, so that readers could better imagine what it looked like, and its foreignness to Muslim-majority refugee families at the school. Finally, I drew together Kawa and Robbie in the concluding sections to create a stronger sense of tension between their needs in relation to the enaction of Anzac Day. With these changes, discussion participants will be able to consider the challenges the principal faces trying to balance the needs of all students.
Our first example about Rocky Choices actually leads us to our second rule of thumb too. Field testing has helped us to identify what we call magic fairy dust solutions. Participants use these ideas about how characters in a case should act in order to sidestep the central ethical dilemma, We call them magic fairy dust solutions because they allow participants to make ethical dilemmas disappear without actually engaging in any meaningful ethical reflection, as if by magic. When participants don't take the needs of the other students in Rocky Choices seriously and focus only on Kate's needs, they make the ethical dilemmas magically disappear. As we heard before, the case is now solved easily. Just pay more attention to Kate.
Now we use this rule of thumb to try to head off magic fairy dust solutions before readers ever even see the case. In taking the action out of civics, for example, we worried that some readers might simply let each teacher in the department choose whether or not to implement the Action Civics project in their own classrooms. Problem solved! So we emphasized in the case that this solution might exacerbate inequities among students and who generally gets access to hands-on, empowering learning, generally those in high-track classes. And for good measure, we added a district coordinator who cares a lot about consistency across all classes. Now discussion participants can't simply leave the key questions about the project up to individual teacher choice. They must grapple with the dilemmas that the case raises.
Sometimes we can foresee potential magic fairy dust solutions as we're writing the case, but sometimes they don't arise until field testing. Let's hear from Alicia Banerjee about her case Remote Control and the magic fairy dust solution that she and her co-author worked to counteract.
My case, Remote Control, which I co-authored with Winston Thompson, takes place in a 4th grade team meeting. The teachers are trying to determine what their camera policy should be on the district's Virtual Fridays, when students will be learning from home. Winston and I worried that readers might find a magic fairy dust solution through virtual backgrounds, which could be standardized so that no student needs to show their home on screen. And in fact, this solution did come up in our field testing. We want readers to use the conversation about the camera policy as a pathway into the deeper and thornier questions around expectations, accountability, equity, and consistency in the classroom. The in-between quality of the Zoom classroom provides an interesting space in which to think about these questions. So while the camera policy is the question at the fore, we hope that readers will actually grapple with these more fundamental dilemmas. So we revised the case to point out that these backgrounds may not work if students have technological constraints, and to add concerns about the social-emotional impact of students being forced to stare at their own image on screen for hours at a time. These small changes eliminate virtual backgrounds as a simple solution and help readers engage with the dilemmas we set forth.
A third rule of thumb is to be on the lookout for details that might allow discussion participants to sidestep the thorny ethical dilemmas the case raises. Rocky Choices again offers a helpful example of what we mean. In addition to ignoring the needs of the other students in the class, discussion participants in our early field tests would simply insist that the problem in the case was that the teacher wasn't trained well enough. If she was a better teacher, she would have no problem meeting the needs of all of her students. From experience, we both know that this isn't the case. Sometimes no amount of training can eliminate the need to make hard, ethically fraught choices about whose interests to prioritize. In order to encourage groups to grapple with this ethical dilemma, rather than evade it, we revised Rocky Choices to specify that the teacher was a veteran teacher with training in supporting students with special needs and with a special certification in science.
To be clear, this change doesn't render the case inauthentic. Veteran, well-trained teachers do run into ethical challenges like this one. As was true for the other change we made to this case, adding this detail didn't fundamentally alter the central dilemma, but it did help groups better engage with the full range of ethical considerations. We also used this rule of thumb with our case Stolen Trust in Dilemmas of Educational Ethics. In that case, a young teacher named Ms. Smith must determine how to respond to a student's theft of her cell phone within the context of a no-excuses school. In early tests, we found that discussion participants avoided the ethical dilemma Ms. Smith faced by focusing all their attention on the drawbacks of the no-excuses model. In the absence of that strict discipline policy, our readers argued, the teacher would face no problems at all. Our goal in Stolen Trust, however, wasn't to set readers up to engage in an ethical evaluation of no-excuses schools. Frankly, we're skeptical of them too. Rather, we wanted to encourage ethical reflection on the dilemmas teachers in that sort of context face.
To shut down this path of evasion, we bulked up the role of the principal and made some key changes to his character, modeling him after Black school leaders I worked with as a teacher in Atlanta. In the revised case, the principal was a black man who defended strict discipline as necessary to teach black boys in particular how to live and be safe in a racist society, an argument I heard a number of times in Atlanta. Whatever the merits of that argument, we found that this change allowed groups to more fully consider the ethical dilemmas faced by teachers in no excuses schools and districts, even though most readers rightly remained skeptical of strict discipline policies. Let's hear from another case author about how they applied this rule of thumb.
Sophomoric skipping is about a group of high school sophomores who take part in a skip day and get caught when they're pulled over by the police. One of the boys now faces the prospect of getting a 0 on a major academic assignment as part of his punishment. I had read other cases about school discipline, but they felt so high stakes, with arrest, retention, and expulsion at play. So I aimed to write a case with low stakes to force engagement with the everyday issues of school discipline, because I found that I was sidestepping the complexities in those other cases in favor of a care-based lens. Even so, early drafts of sophomoric skipping had a more dramatic incident where police officers handcuffed the students who had skipped school, and videos of them crying circulated through social media. But field tests revealed that many readers were concerned at the lack of trauma-informed care the boys received. After I toned down the incident to the police running a background check with flashing lights and the boys being nervous, people were more able to focus on the questions of academic impacts of behavioral discipline, how uniform policies can have unequal results, and the question of how much is enough that most teachers and administrators grapple with every day.
One final rule of thumb we follow is to provide key demographic information for either all main characters or no main characters. In the United States, where race is a particularly salient identity marker, this rule of thumbs means that we provide the race of all main characters or none in our cases. This is partly an ethical commitment on our part to avoid making the all too common mistake that issues of race only matter once a person of color walks into the room. Race can structure group dynamics even in all-white groups where race is unacknowledged. In fact, one should ask what structural or other features have led to the group being so racially homogeneous in the first place. Equally important, we follow this rule of thumb to remind us that how race is talked about in a case, or not talked about, plays a big role in how groups will understand a case.
In taking the action out of civics, for example, we knew that research shows that project-based civics curricula have a particularly positive impact on students of color and students from other marginalized groups. We also knew that critics of this kind of civics education have been citing action civics as a divisive theory akin to critical race theory. We wanted the readers of the case to talk about the racial undertones of the critique, so we explicitly gave the race for the main characters in the case. Mr. Walsh is white, as are Emily and most of the other teachers in the social studies department, while Juan and Darren are named as people of color, with Darren specifically identifying as black. Racing the characters helps the reader understand both the arguments being made for and against the Action Civics project, as well as the community in which the school is located.
And sometimes we actually leave out key demographic information, which can open up interesting conversations. Sometimes people make assumptions about a character's race, for example, and then discover that their fellow participants have made completely different assumptions. And sometimes discussion groups end up talking about how different demographics might influence the way they view the case. In Rocky Choices, for example, would we think differently about Kate's needs and challenges if she were a child of color versus a white child? What about Frank or Philip?
In taking the action out of civics, race is the key demographic feature that we decided to name. But in other cases, there are other demographic features that are more important. Let's hear again from Lauren Bialystok about the decisions she made about providing the religious backgrounds of her characters in Faith and Mr. D.
When I thought about how to write this case, it was obvious that I would be labeling some characters as Muslim and focusing on the needs of that religious community, but I did not want to make it a dilemma that could be interpreted as Muslims' interests versus everyone else's interests. This would have been inaccurate as well as potentially stigmatizing. Furthermore, in the province where these events occurred, there is a publicly funded Catholic system, and the controversy over cafeteria prayers drew in other religious minority groups, including Jews and Hindus. I therefore decided to represent actors of different religious backgrounds in the case, including multiple Muslim characters, to show that no religious community is monolithic. I did not follow the rule of providing this demographic information for every character, however. Most significantly, The protagonist, Mr. D, is not categorized by religion, though it can be inferred that he is not Muslim. Religion is different from race in that not everyone has a religion. I wanted to show that being a religious outsider can also be an identity with important implications in educational dilemmas.
As we've seen from these examples, the rules of thumb don't exhaust all of the considerations relevant to making micro-level decisions, but they do prove helpful. Ultimately, there's no substitute for organizing a discussion and seeing how a case performs. We'll talk more about field testing in Unit 5. For now, we want to encourage you to keep these 4 rules of thumb in mind as you continue to think about the structure and outline of your case.